What's up, everyone? Welcome into Week 10's Fantasy Kickoff. I'm Kendall Mirsky, and each week I'm going to highlight some starts, some sits, maybe a sleeper or two if they present themselves given the matchup, maybe some streamers depending on bye weeks. And then to wrap things up, I'll be diving a little bit deeper into the data to identify some players that I'll either be upgrading or downgrading my expectations for based on their matchups. Let's dive into it. All right, we'll be starting with starts of the week, and my first start is Jackson Dart at Chicago this week on Sunday. I think a lot of people have been skittish to trust Jackson Dart in what is admittedly a flawed offense that lacks some talent and has been very injured. But Dart has been making it work, and fantasy managers should be taking it seriously. He's averaging 22.4 fantasy points per game as a starter, which is the third most by a rookie quarterback since 1970. He's been a top 5 quarterback in 3 of his last 4 games, and they haven't been a cakewalk matchups. Like, all of them have been difficult. It's been against Philadelphia, it's been against Denver, and maybe a little bit easier against San Francisco, but he's making it work. This week, he draws the Bears, who have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. A lot of his production has been buoyed by his rushing upside. He's averaging 9.2 rushing fantasy points per game as a starter, which is the most among quarterbacks this season. On top of that, he leads quarterbacks with 21 designed runs this season and 251 rush yards since becoming the starter in week 4. This bodes well for him as the Bears have allowed the second most rush yards to quarterbacks in the last 4 weeks. On top of all of that, I expect this to be a high-scoring game as the Giants and Bears are bottom 5 in points per game allowed this season, and both have allowed over 27 points per game. My second start of the week is Matthew Stafford at the 49ers on Sunday. Stafford has been on fire lately, scoring at least 25 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games, and his 23.3 fantasy points per game since week 4 is second most among quarterbacks. Additionally, Stafford is the 4th player in NFL history with 20-plus pass touchdowns and fewer than 3 interceptions through a team's first 8 games in a season. Going up against the division rival 49ers in Week 10, he did score 25.56 fantasy points against them earlier in Week 5 this season. And the 49ers have allowed at least 19 fantasy points to a quarterback in 4 of their last 5 games, after doing so in just 1 of their first 4 games this season. A lot of my confidence comes down to the 49ers' lack of pressure on quarterbacks. They have the lowest quarterback pressure rate in the NFL, and Stafford leads the NFL with 17 pass touchdowns on dropbacks without pressure. On top of that, the 49ers have blitzed at the 5th lowest rate this season, and Stafford is 5th among quarterbacks in yards per pass and success rate on dropbacks without being blitzed this season. So in a week with Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott, and crazy enough to say this, but Joe Flacco on a bye, you got to go check and see if Jackson Dart and maybe even Matthew Stafford are on your waiver wire to plug into that spot this week. Moving on to sits of the week, I only have one, and it's sticking on the quarterback theme. It's Baker Mayfield versus the Patriots. Going into his bye week, Baker's fantasy points decreased in 3 straight games, finishing with just 4 points against the Saints in week 8. He's currently 23rd among 33 qualified quarterbacks with a 63.9 completion percentage this season. The big catalyst for his production last season was touchdowns, and he's had at least 3 pass touchdowns in just 1 of his 8 games this season. On top of that, a big reason he started so strong this year was from a lot of rushing production as a scrambler, and that has died off a little bit recently. There are a couple of reasons I'm concerned about his matchup specifically against the Patriots this week. First is his intermediate passing. He has the 4th highest intermediate pass rate among quarterbacks this season, and this is defined as pass attempts between 10 and 19 air yards. However, he has the 6th lowest completion percentage on those passes. The Patriots, on the other hand, have forced the 5th most interceptions on intermediate passes and have the 5th fewest yards per intermediate pass attempt this season. The second concern is Baker's ineffectiveness against man coverage. And a lot of this comes down to the injuries that the Bucs have faced at the wide receiver position and just not having the players necessary to separate against man coverage. But unfortunately, Baker is averaging just 4.3 yards per pass against man coverage this season, which is 3rd fewest in the NFL. The Patriots already play man coverage at a rate above league average, and I would imagine they will try to test the depth of the Bucs pass catchers to see if they can separate versus man. And this even extends to Emeka Egbuka, who is working through that hamstring injury. So for Baker's sake, you hope that Emeka is working through that and he's getting healthier coming off the bye. But given all of the data and the tendencies that we've seen, I am scared off from this, and I would be sitting him if I have another option at the quarterback position, like one of the two quarterbacks I mentioned and some other ones that will be coming on later in the episode. All right, moving on next, I'm going to move on to sleepers, and they're kind of also streamers this week because I want to talk about tight ends. With Travis Kelce and Jake Ferguson on bye, and then the tragic injury to Tucker Kraft, I thought I should give a couple of tight end sleeper options this week. And the first one is Kyle Pitts. He plays the Colts this week, and he has scored at least 13 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games after doing so in just 1 of his first 5 games this season. Over the last 3 weeks, he has the most routes, targets, and receptions among tight ends. Beyond just the last 3 weeks, he leads tight ends with a 93% route participation rate and has the second highest target share among tight ends this season, behind only Trey McBride. Like I said, he'll be playing the Colts, but it will be in Berlin early on Sunday morning, so make sure to set your lineups for that one. Indy has allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end in each of their last 4 games, and they've allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. The next option is Bills tight end Dalton Kincaid playing in Miami against the Dolphins on Sunday. Kincaid posted 17.6 fantasy points against Miami back in week 3 this season, which was good for tight end for that week. I'm sure Kincaid has been a frustrating case study for managers as he isn't on the field as much as we'd hope, but when he is, he's very productive. He's one of 3 players and the only tight end with at least 90 fantasy points on fewer than 200 snaps this season. Now, the other 2 players are David Montgomery and RJ Harvey, which should illustrate how difficult it is to parse out when he should be in your starting lineup from week to week. Kincaid leads all tight ends in yards per route and fantasy points per target this season, and the Dolphins have allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. On top of that, Miami has allowed a top 6 tight end in back-to-back weeks. All right, moving on to my upgrades. Now, these are players that I have upgraded my confidence on relative to their matchups this week. And it doesn't mean you need to get them into starting lineups, but I expect their projection to get a little bit of a boost this week. So the first one, this is pretty easy to explain after I picked on the Commanders defense last week with Sam Darnold as a start of the week, and Darnold finished that game with more pass touchdowns than incompletions. Washington has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season, and at least 19 plus fantasy points to the quarterback position in each of their last 4 games. The Commanders have been terribly ineffective against the pass, allowing a league-high 8.4 yards per pass attempt this season, which is the most in the NFL since the winless 2008 Lions. This lines up for my upgrade, Jared Goff, who has been excelling in the intermediate level of the field. He trails only Lamar Jackson in yards and EPA per intermediate pass this season. Meanwhile, the Commanders have allowed 28 explosive pass plays versus intermediate pass attempts this season, which is tied for the most in the NFL. This ties into kind of a layered upgrade for the Lions in Jameson Williams, and Lions offensive coordinator John Morton met with Williams privately during the Lions Week 8 bye. Morton said he took the blame for Williams' slow start this season, saying that he, quote, failed him over the first 7 games and that he, quote, has to do a better job with that. Then Jameson Williams followed that up with 6 targets, 4 receptions, 66 yards, and a touchdown in week 9. That's just his 3rd game this season with at least 6 targets, and I expect that to continue as Williams is the only player on the Lions with at least 10 targets and at least 10 air yards per target this season, meaning he should be one of the primary options for the Lions to seek those explosive plays that the Commanders have been so vulnerable giving up this season. So if I can, I'm trying to find ways to stack Jared Goff with really any pass catcher, but I think because of the explosive vulnerabilities that the Commanders have. I think that best player is Jameson Williams, who has been very elusive in his own right to figure out the boom or bust nature of when to get him into your lineups. But this feels like a nice fit this week. My last upgrade goes to the entire Bears running back room slated to play the Giants on Sunday. Full transparency, I am recording this on Wednesday afternoon, so I'm not sure if DeAndre Swift will be active on Sunday after missing week 9 with the groin injury. However, I think Kyle Monangai holds value regardless this week. The Bears really made an effort to emphasize the run game during their week 5 bye. In weeks 1 through 4, they were averaging 62.3 rush yards per game and 3.4 yards per rush with their running backs, both of which were second fewest in the NFL over that span. Now, since week 6, the Bears are averaging the most rush yards per game and the third most yards per rush by their running backs. Now, this is going to get very stat heavy, even more so than it just did, so bear with me, but Chicago runs outside with their running backs at the second highest rate this season, but they do so very, very effectively, ranking top 4 in success rate, explosive rushes, EPA per rush, and yards before contact per rush with their running backs on outside rushes this season. Conversely, the Giants, they're dead last in defending outside runs by running backs in so many categories. Rush yards over expected per rush, EPA per rush, success rate, yards before contact, and explosive rushes. Everything points to this being a big rushing game for the Bears offense, kind of like what we saw them do versus the Saints earlier this year. They just wanted to establish the run, and it's what they like to do. They like to run the football since the bye, but not only that, it's how they like to run the football, and it lines up perfectly with what the Giants don't defend well. So keep an eye on DeAndre Swift's health as we approach Sunday. But either way, I think if you're in a pinch, if you have injuries, I think Kyle Monangai holds value regardless of DeAndre Swift's health. But obviously, if DeAndre Swift is in, you got to get him into your lineups this week. All right, last segment here is downgrades. Like I said, same thing with upgrades. If you can't afford to get this guy on your bench, you don't need to make it happen. But in my opinion, these are guys that downgrade the expectations, shave off maybe 2, 3, 4 points off their projections. I think the matchup is just a little scary based on their tendencies, their habits, and what they do well. So the first one is Trevor Lawrence against the Texans. I told you this was going to be a heavy quarterback episode, but we have another one here. I think you should try to look elsewhere if you can. If you're looking at Trevor Lawrence as a bye week fill-in, I think you just got to go in a different direction. I know he scored at least 17 fantasy points in 4 straight games, but the Texans have allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. Lawrence on his own, he scored just 7.78 fantasy points in week 3 against the Texans earlier this season, and the same issues present themselves yet again in week 10. Lawrence struggles versus zone and against teams that drop at least 7 players into coverage, meaning they're not blitzing. They're sending 3 or 4 pass rushers maximum. Houston has the 11th lowest blitz rate in the NFL, but have allowed the fewest EPA per dropback without blitzing this season. Meanwhile, Lawrence has the 3rd fewest yards per pass attempt on plays that he isn't blitzed this season. And on top of that, the Texans play zone coverage at the 4th highest rate this season and allow the 2nd fewest yards per play in zone. Lawrence has the 3rd lowest completion percentage over expectation and 5th fewest yards per pass attempt against zone coverage this season. I don't expect these numbers to change much for him in week 10, considering how injured his wide receiver room is, and that it will likely take some time for him to build chemistry with Jacoby Myers after their recent acquisition of him at the trade deadline. All right, the last downgrade is jam-packed and even features a bonus upgrade, so stick with me on this one. It's all about the Cardinals, and it's all really on the Cardinals side of things in their game against the Seattle Seahawks. I want to start with the running back position. From week to week, it's been really, really difficult to project who will get the most touches at the running back position since Trey Benson's injury, coincidentally, in week 4 against the Seahawks. But one week it was Michael Carter, another week it was Bam Knight. This most recent week it was Amari DiMercato. So you really got to be on your toes there just to figure out who's going to get the touches. But even on top of that, it's a really unfavorable matchup. The Seahawks have allowed one top 12 running back since week 3, and they've allowed the second fewest yards per rush to running backs on the entire season. I'd stay away from the Cardinals running backs this week, but the one weakness they have shown is that they are susceptible through the air to running backs. They've allowed the 5th most receiving yards to running backs this season, and the Cardinals have the 9th highest pass rate in the NFL. So although I don't feel confident about the running backs as a whole, knowing which one to pick, if there is one that I have to pick and you're in a pinch and you just need a running back this week, the one I have the most confidence to clear 10 fantasy points would have to be Amari DiMercato because of his passing game impact, because I expect the Cardinals to be trailing in this game, and if they are, he's probably the guy that's going to be catching the passes to do so. The next layer to this downgrade is to Marvin Harrison Jr. Despite his career game in week 9, the Seahawks play zone at the 5th highest rate in the NFL, and they've allowed the 7th fewest yards per play when using zone coverage this season. Since Jacoby Brissett's first start in week 6, Harrison has caught all 5 of his targets against man coverage, posting a catch rate over expectation of plus 48%. However, in that same span with Brissett, his catch rate over expectation versus zone is negative 15.8%. So a massive, massive, massive split in his man versus zone catch rate over expectation. Much, much weaker in zone. And for much of this season, the Cardinals' answer versus zone coverage has been their tight end, Trey McBride. He leads the team with 33.8% target share versus zone since week 6 when Brissett took over, and that's good for 5th highest in the NFL and highest among tight ends in that span. So in totality for this game, downgrade to the Cardinals running backs, Marvin Harrison Jr., but an upgrade to Trey McBride. All right, that's going to do it for Week 10's Fantasy Kickoff. Thank you to everyone who stuck around, and I hope this advice can help you in your fantasy matchups this week. If you like the content, please hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps me and everyone behind the scenes here at Numbers Game Media. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you all the best of luck in your fantasy matchups, and I'll see you all next